At my younger sister Corinne's wedding, my 11-year-old daughter Sadie stood exactly where the bride had told her to stand, on a small strip of silver tape behind the train of an $18,000 gown. A minute later, Corinne stepped backward. The lace swept around Sadie's shoes, and my daughter hit the floor hard enough to split the skin on her knee. Before I could reach her, Corinne spun around and screamed, "You useless little brat! Don't ever come near me again." My mother rushed past the bleeding child to inspect the dress. Then she pointed toward the doors and said, "Sadie will apologize right now, or both of you can get out." 200 guests went silent. Sadie was shaking so badly that the pressed flower bracelet she had made for her aunt slipped from her hand and broke beside the torn lace. I did not argue. I knelt, wrapped my jacket around my daughter, and looked at the 4 adults standing over her. Then I said, "Before my daughter apologizes, Corinne should tell Owen why $86,000 from Sadie's trust paid for this wedding." The screaming started before I finished the sentence. My father called me a liar. My mother tried to pull me away. Corinne demanded that security remove us, while her groom stared at the flowers, the champagne, and the ballroom, as if every beautiful thing around him had suddenly become evidence. But the money was not the worst part. Inside my purse was a document showing that security had been ordered to prepare a report against Sadie 15 minutes before she ever fell. And by midnight, another $162,000 was scheduled to leave her trust. That was when I understood the truth. The ruined dress was never the disaster they feared. It was the trap they needed me to walk into. The document in my purse proved they had planned to throw us out before Sadie ever touched the dress. Stay with me to hear how one torn wedding dress exposed what my family had been hiding, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about betrayal, courage, and the moment silence finally ends. 3 days before the wedding, Sadie sat at the long cutting table in the back of my bridal restoration shop, arranging pressed white violets beneath wax paper. She had spent 2 evenings making the bracelet for Corinne. Each flower came from the garden behind our apartment, and every petal had been flattened inside one of my old pattern books. "Do you think Aunt Corinne will wear it during the ceremony?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the 1,948 satin gowns spread across my work table. "She may already have jewelry chosen, but she will know you made it for her." Sadie studied the bracelet, as though love could be measured by how carefully the flowers were placed. "Grandma said Corinne has been too busy to answer my messages. Planning a wedding can make people busy." The answer sounded protective, even to me. I had spent years learning not to excuse my family, yet old habits still surfaced when Sadie looked hopeful. I had not wanted to attend the wedding. My contact with my parents had been polite and limited for several years. I had stopped trying to persuade them that Corinne and I deserved the same standards because every conversation ended in the same place. Corinne needed help. Meredith would manage. When we were teenagers, my father used part of my college savings to cover Corinne's private school tuition after she was expelled from the public district. Years later, my mother missed the opening of my shop because Corinne called after a breakup. The details changed, but the rule remained. Corinne's crisis was urgent. My disappointment proved I was strong enough to cope. I had made peace with that pattern by stepping away from it. Sadie was the reason I agreed to return. "She is still my aunt," Sadie had said when the invitation arrived. "Maybe this could be different." The shop phone rang while Sadie tied the bracelet with a narrow blue ribbon. The display showed Nora Beckett. Nora had served as the independent protector of Sadie's trust since my great-grandmother Ruth died. Ruth had left the fund for Sadie's education and future security with my father, Leonard, named as trustee because of his banking career. I did not control the account, but I received reports, could challenge transactions, and could contact Nora if anything appeared improper. I carried the phone into my office and closed the glass door. "Meredith, has your family sent you documents connected to Ashford House?" Nora asked. The name was familiar. Ashford House was the estate where Corinne's wedding would be held. No. Why? There is a proposed disbursement connected to the property. I am reviewing the supporting materials, so I am not making an accusation. Do not sign, approve, or verbally confirm anything your family presents this weekend. A cold pressure settled beneath my ribs. Is Sadie's money involved? It may be represented as an investment made for her benefit. I need the complete file before I can determine whether it is allowed. Has money already moved? Nora paused. I am confirming the sequence. Do not confront anyone based only on this call. Photograph anything you are shown and contact me before you agree to it. Nora never dramatized. The restraint in her voice concerned me more than an alarm would have. When I returned, Sadie was holding the finished bracelet against her wrist. Was that about work? Paperwork, I said. Nothing you need to worry about. The rehearsal at Ashford House began that evening. Corinne greeted us near the entrance, with both hands extended, and a photographer behind her. There are my two favorite girls, she said brightly. She kissed Sadie's cheek and held up the bracelet while the photographer captured the moment. This is beautiful. You made it yourself? Sadie nodded, glowing. The moment the camera turned away, Corinne placed the bracelet in my hand. Keep this safe. It does not match tomorrow's jewelry. I slipped the bracelet into its box. During the rehearsal, Corinne corrected Sadie's posture twice and reminded her not to touch the gown. When we were alone near the staircase, she asked whether I had received any calls from a bank or attorney. Why would you ask that? She adjusted the cuff of her robe. Dad said there might be last-minute paperwork. I do not want business interrupting my wedding. Before I could ask what business, Owen joined us carrying printed programs. One line near the bottom caught my attention. Private investment signing, following the champagne toast. What are you signing tomorrow? I asked. Owen glanced at Corinne. Preliminary papers for a project. We are looking at turning Ashford House into a permanent wedding venue. During your reception, the owners want the deal moving quickly. It is only a ceremonial step. My father appeared beside us so smoothly that I wondered how long he had been listening. It is a simple portfolio restructuring, Leonard said. Ashford House is a strong asset, and the arrangement will benefit Sadie in the long term. I looked at him. Why is Sadie connected to your project? He smiled with the calm confidence that had once made clients trust him with their retirement accounts. Not every use of a trust is a withdrawal. Sometimes money has to work. You should be pleased I found an opportunity with real property behind it. The answer came too quickly and sounded prepared for a question he had expected. Nora told me not to approve anything this weekend, I said. For the first time, his expression tightened. Corinne lowered her voice. Could we please not turn my rehearsal into one of your investigations? I asked one question, and Dad answered it. My mother, Judith, touched my arm. Let Leonard handle what he understands. You came for Sadie, remember? That was exactly why I had come. And suddenly it was also why I could not ignore what I had heard. After sunset, guests drifted toward the terrace, while Sadie helped gather ribbon from the aisle. I went inside for our coats. At the far end of the corridor, Leonard stood outside the bridal suite with a thick cream envelope. A dark blue seal from the Trust Administration Company crossed the flap. He passed it to Corinne. She opened it enough to examine the first page, then looked up and saw me. Her fingers closed over the papers as she stepped inside the room. Just before Corinne closed the bridal suite door, I saw Sadie's name printed in the corner of the papers my father had just handed her. The next morning, the papers with Sadie's name were still the first thing on my mind. I had called Nora twice before leaving our hotel, but both calls went to voicemail. She had warned me not to sign anything, and I intended to follow that instruction. What I did not know was whether the money had already moved, or why Corinne had been holding documents connected to my daughter's trust. Sadie stood in front of the mirror while I fastened the sash on her pale blue dress. She looked excited rather than nervous, which made it harder to tell her that anything might be wrong. "Do you think Aunt Corinne changed her mind about the bracelet?" she asked. The small box rested beside her shoes. After Corinne had returned it during the rehearsal, Sadie had replaced one crushed violet and tied a new ribbon around it. "You can offer it to her again," I said. "What she does with it will not change how much care you put into making it." Sadie nodded, though I could tell she was hoping for a different answer. Ashford House looked almost unreal in the morning light. White flowers covered the stone entrance, a string quartet played beside the lake, and rows of chairs faced an arch wrapped in roses and trailing greenery. Staff carried silver trays between the terrace and the reception hall, while photographers moved through the crowd. Corinne had wanted a wedding that looked expensive from every direction, and she had succeeded. Her gown alone was worth more than many of the restoration projects that passed through my shop in an entire season. The silk bodice had been fitted precisely, and the train was covered with hand-applied lace that extended several feet behind her. I understood why she wanted it photographed from every angle. I also understood how the train was supposed to be secured when she needed to walk without assistance. Sadie found Corinne near the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids, makeup artists, and 2 photographers. "I fixed it," she said, opening the bracelet box. "The flower that bent is new." Corinne glanced at the photographer beside her before her expression softened. "You made this for me?" she asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Sadie smiled and held out the bracelet. Corinne slipped it over her wrist while the photographer captured several pictures. She leaned down, kissed Sadie's cheek, and called her the sweetest niece in the world. The moment the photographer moved away, Corinne removed the bracelet. "Kayla, hold this somewhere safe," she told her assistant. Sadie watched the box disappear into a large tote bag already filled with cosmetics, chargers, and folded papers. "I thought maybe you could wear it during the ceremony," she said. Corinne was examining her reflection. "It does not work with the diamonds, sweetheart. You understand." Sadie said she did, but her hands folded tightly in front of her. I placed one hand between her shoulders and guided her toward the other attendants, before Corinne could see how much the answer had hurt. The rehearsal plan had placed Sadie beside a grown bridesmaid named Hannah. Hannah was supposed to help manage the train and make sure Sadie entered at the correct moment. Less than an hour before the ceremony, Corinne changed the arrangement. "I want Sadie behind me for the final photographs," she told Tessa Monroe, the wedding coordinator. "The height difference will make the composition better." Tessa looked down at her tablet. She practiced beside Hannah. Moving her behind the train might make it difficult for her to see where she is stepping. "She is 11, not 4, Corinne replied. "She can stand on a mark." A staff member placed a narrow strip of silver tape on the floor behind the gown. Tessa glanced at me, then quickly looked back at her schedule. "Is this only for the photographs?" I asked. Corinne gave me a patient smile. "It is my wedding, Meredith. I think I can decide where people stand in my pictures." I looked at Tessa. Was this change made this morning? She tapped the edge of her tablet with one finger. It was a last-minute request from the bride. Her tone was professional, but her shoulders were rigid. Before I could ask anything else, she said she needed to check the musicians and walked toward the terrace. Sadie stepped onto the silver tape as instructed. The edge of the train nearly touched her shoes. "Do not move unless someone tells you," I said quietly. "I won't." While Corinne posed, I studied the back of the gown. The train had been lifted earlier with a bustle loop, a reinforced thread loop designed to hold the weight without tearing the lace. Now the train lay loose again. At first, I assumed someone had released it for the photographs. Then I saw the thread near the seam. It had not snapped under pressure. The end was clean and straight, the way thread looked after being cut with sharp scissors. Someone had pushed a thin pin through the damaged loop to make it appear secured. The pin was too weak for the weight of the train. It might hold while Corinne stood still, but it would slip the moment she changed direction. I moved closer. "Who adjusted the bustle?" Corinne continued smiling toward the camera. "One of the dress assistants." "Which one?" "I have no idea. There have been people touching this dress all morning. I reached toward the pin, but she turned sharply. Please do not start working on my gown now. I paid professionals to handle it. I am not trying to alter it. The loop has been cut. Judith appeared beside me before Corinne could respond. Meredith, not everything needs to become an investigation. I restore gowns for a living. I know the difference between broken thread and cut thread. My mother lowered her voice. Your sister is already nervous. Do not plant another problem in her mind. Corinne called for the photographer to move behind her. He repositioned himself until the lens was aimed directly at the train and the silver mark beneath Sadie's feet. Corinne asked him to keep shooting continuously as she turned toward the terrace doors. I felt the same cold pressure I had felt during Nora's call. Before I could move Sadie, a broad man in a dark suit stepped between me and the doorway. Miss Whitlock, may I see your wristband again? He had checked it when we entered. I held up my wrist. You already scanned it. Routine verification. He looked at Sadie's band as well, then spoke into the microphone clipped beneath his collar. How do you know my name? I asked. He glanced at the printed guest card hanging from my bag. The card only said Meredith. It did not include my last name. Mr. Price briefs us on members of the wedding party, he said. Leonard was not Mr. Price. Owen's family name was Carlyle, and Corinne had not changed hers yet. Who is Mr. Price? The man's expression did not shift. I need to return to my position. He walked toward the exit, but remained close enough to watch us. I saw another security employee standing near the opposite door. Neither man was watching the crowd. Both were watching Sadie and me. Judith took my arm. You promised you would not create tension today. I have not created anything. You are questioning the staff, inspecting the dress, and making Sadie nervous. Sadie had heard her name. She looked over from the silver mark. I lowered my voice. Then explain why security knows who I am before I introduce myself. My mother's grip tightened for a moment. Your father wanted to make sure nothing interrupted the signing. What does that have to do with me? She released my arm. Please let Corinne have one perfect day. It was the same request my family had made for years. They never asked Corinne to behave differently. They asked everyone else to absorb the consequences quietly. The photographer called for the bridal party to hold their positions. Sadie looked down to make sure both shoes remained inside the silver line. Corinne faced forward, but I saw her glance over one shoulder. Then she stepped backward. The pin holding the bustle slipped free. The full weight of the train dropped across Sadie's shoes and wrapped around her ankles. Sadie tried to step away, but the lace tightened. Her arms lifted instinctively before she fell onto the stone floor. Her knee struck first. The sound was small, but her cry carried across the terrace. A section of lace tore as Corinne spun around. Instead of looking at Sadie, she grabbed the damaged train with both hands. You useless little brat, she screamed. Don't ever come near me again. Sadie stared up at her, stunned. Blood had already begun running down her shin. I moved toward my daughter, but Judith reached the dress first. She lifted the torn lace and examined it with horror. Look what you have done, she told Sadie. Apologize to your aunt right now, or you and your mother can get out. Guests turned in their chairs. The musicians stopped playing. Sadie tried to push herself upright, but her injured leg folded beneath her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to. The two security officers were already moving toward us. They had crossed half the terrace before anyone had called for them. I knelt beside Sadie, pressed a clean handkerchief against her knee, and wrapped my jacket around her shoulders. Her whole body trembled beneath my hands. It was an accident, she said. Mom, I ruined everything. I looked at the cut thread, the silver tape, the photographer still standing behind the train, and the security officers waiting to remove us. Then I stood and faced Corinne, my parents, and the man she was about to marry. Before my daughter apologizes, Corinne should tell Owen why $86,420 from Sadie's trust paid for this wedding. For several seconds, no one moved. The lake breeze lifted the torn lace beside Corinne's shoes. Sadie remained pressed against my side, one hand gripping my jacket while blood darkened the handkerchief over her knee. Around us, guests stared as though they were waiting for someone to explain that they had misunderstood me. Owen was the first to speak. What, $86,000? Corinne turned toward him. She does this when she feels ignored, she said. Meredith takes one piece of information and builds an accusation around it. I asked what money she is talking about. There is no stolen money. I had not used the word stolen. Corinne had supplied it herself. Leonard stepped between us, his voice measured enough to sound reasonable to anyone who did not know him. This is a private family disagreement. My older daughter has chosen the worst possible moment to create another scene. My daughter is bleeding because your other daughter arranged for her to stand behind a damaged bustle. You turn an accident into a conspiracy because you cannot tolerate not being in control. Judith moved closer and lowered her voice. Meredith, take Sadie inside, let someone clean her knee, and stop humiliating your sister. We can discuss whatever paperwork has confused you after the wedding. The word confused was deliberate. My father used financial language to make people doubt themselves. My mother softened the insult until it sounded like concern. I reached into my purse without releasing Sadie. The security officers shifted toward me, but I withdrew only a single folded page. It was the summary Nora had emailed shortly before we left the hotel. I had printed it because she warned me not to rely on my phone if anyone tried to take it. I am not confused. This page lists 4 disbursements from Sadie's trust during the last 6 weeks. Owen stepped closer, but I kept the paper in my hand. $22,000 went to Whitebriar Floral. $28,600 went to Hartwell Catering. $11,820 went to Bell and Reed Photography. $24,000 went to Ashford Hospitality Preview. The total was $86,420. A murmur moved across the terrace. The florist near the arch looked toward the catering director. One photographer lowered his camera. Corinne folded her arms. Those are business expenses. They are your wedding vendors. They are part of the launch. Owen looked at her. You knew the trust paid them? Her expression changed for only a moment, but it was enough. Leonard reached for the statement. Give me that before you misrepresent it further. I moved the page out of his reach. You can explain it without taking it. He faced Owen and the nearest guests, as though addressing a boardroom. Ashford House is an underperforming historic property with substantial commercial potential. These expenditures are pre-development marketing costs connected to a proposed equity position for the trust. He continued with phrases such as asset appreciation, hospitality conversion, and long-term beneficiary value. He made flowers sound like market research and champagne sound like due diligence. Some guests began nodding, relieved to hear words that made the situation sound complicated rather than wrong. I waited until he stopped. Did Nora approve those expenses? The trustee has investment discretion. That was not my question. The formal documentation is being completed today. Owen stared at the summary. Leonard told me the family trust was investing in the property. He did not say it had already paid for the wedding. It did not pay for the wedding, Corinne said. It paid for the preview event. I looked around at the rose arch, the orchestra, and the champagne waiting on silver trays. Your preview event includes your wedding vows. Corinne's face reddened. Sadie is 11 years old. She has 7 years before she even needs that money. Dad is going to put everything back long before college. The words settled over the terrace more heavily than my accusation had. Owen turned toward her. You knew it was Sadie's money. I knew it was from the family trust. That is not the same thing as stealing from a child. You just said she would not need it for 7 years. I said what Dad explained to me. Owen rubbed one hand over his mouth, then looked toward the guests, whispering into their phones. Can we finish the ceremony and pause the signing? He asked. Everyone is here. The vendors have been paid. We can review the documents tomorrow with attorneys. He did not look shocked by the investment. He looked alarmed that its source had been named aloud. Did you know Sadie's trust was part of the Ashford purchase? I knew there was family capital involved. That is not an answer. I knew Leonard managed a fund intended for Sadie. He told me the property would increase its value. Corinne grabbed his arm. Then you understand this is not what Meredith is making it sound like. Owen did not pull away. We should not decide this in front of 200 people. Sadie trembled against me. The handkerchief over her knee was soaked through, and no one in my family had asked whether she could stand. I am not deciding anything here. I am taking my daughter to the medical room. Any further conversation happens with Nora Beckett or another attorney present. Leonard lowered his voice. If you walk away now, you will make this look worse than it is. My daughter needs first aid. One security officer stepped into my path. We have instructions to escort you from the property. Your own incident policy requires medical assessment before removing an injured minor, Tessa said from behind him. She stood near the aisle holding her tablet against her chest. Her face was pale, but her voice remained professional. The first aid room is inside the west corridor. No guest, especially a child, will be denied treatment because of a dispute. The officer looked toward Corinne. Tessa, this is my wedding, and Ashford House is responsible for safety on the premises. Tessa led us through a side entrance. I kept one arm around Sadie while she limped beside me. Behind us, voices rose across the terrace, but the ceremony did not resume. The first aid room held an examination table, a sink, and a cabinet of supplies. A staff medic washed Sadie's knee, applied antiseptic, and covered the cut with a large bandage. It was painful but did not require stitches. Sadie stared at her folded hands. I'm sorry, Mom. You do not need to apologize for falling. I should have moved faster. You stood where you were told to stand. But if I had not torn the dress, you would not have said anything about the money. Grandma would not be mad, and Aunt Corinne could still get married. Her face was too raw for a speech. You were hurt. The adults around you chose what they did next. That choice belongs to them. She leaned against my shoulder. Tessa waited until the medic left, then locked the door. Her hands shook slightly as she opened a folder beneath her tablet. I should have shown you this before the photographs. She placed a printed email on the counter. The sender was Corinne. The recipients included Tessa, the head of security, and the venue manager. The timestamp read 2:12 p.m. The message instructed staff to prepare an incident report in advance. If Sadie caused any problem involving the gown, security was to classify it as deliberate property damage and remove both her and me before the private investment signing. Sadie hat fallen at 2:27. I read the time twice, then looked at the blank report attached behind it. My daughter's name had already been typed into the subject field. The report calling Sadie, the child who caused the damage, had been opened in the system 15 minutes before she ever touched the dress. The timestamp on Corinne's email was 2:12 p.m. Sadie had fallen at 2:27. I read the message once more, then turned to Tessa. Where is the dress now? In the bridal suite. Corinne demanded that the venue seamstress repair it before anyone took more photographs. I need to see the damaged section before it is altered. Tessa hesitated. She will accuse me of giving you access to her property. She has already prepared a report accusing my daughter of damaging it deliberately. If that report is ever used, the condition of the bustle matters. Tessa looked at Sadie, who sat on the examination table with her bandaged knee extended in front of her. Then she called a venue attendant named Marcy and asked her to bring the gown to the private fitting room beside the medical office. She made it clear that the dress was not to be repaired until 2 staff members had documented its condition. Fabric remembered what had happened to it. Thread broken under weight, frayed and twisted. Thread cut by scissors kept a sharp flat end. Corinne's bustle loop had been cut close to the reinforced seam. Someone had then pushed a narrow straight pin through the remaining thread and into the lace. The pin was intended for light positioning during fittings, not for supporting a long silk train. I showed Tessa and Marcy the clean end of the loop and the small puncture where the pin had been placed. If the loop had broken when Sadie stepped on the dress, the thread would be pulled and uneven, I said. This was cut first. The pin held while Corinne stood still, but it could not hold when she stepped backward. Marcy leaned closer without touching the fabric. A bridal seamstress would never secure that weight with this pin. Tessa photographed the loop, the pin, and the torn lace from several angles. She added a ruler beside the damaged section and saved the images to the venue's incident file. I did not say Corinne had intended to make Sadie bleed. I had no evidence of that, and I did not believe she had thought beyond the scene she wanted to create. She needed a visible problem involving the gown. She needed Sadie standing where the train could catch her feet. She needed security ready before anyone had time to ask why. The cut loop, the silver mark, and the email created 15 minutes before the fall all pointed in the same direction. "Who asked you to put the tape behind the dress?" I asked. "Corinne did," Tessa said. "She sent a diagram this morning and told me the child had to stand directly on the mark. I questioned it because it was different from rehearsal." "And the report?" "She said there had been family tension and she wanted security prepared if you disrupted the signing. I thought she expected an argument. I did not know she planned to put Sadie behind a loose train." Tessa's voice tightened. She had expected a difficult relative, not a plan that used a child. "Will you keep the original email and the system record?" I asked. "Yes. I will also write down when the position changed and who was present." Sadie looked from the dress to me. "Did Aunt Corinne want me to fall?" I sat beside her. "I do not know that she wanted you hurt. I know she created a situation where something was likely to go wrong, and she had already decided to blame you if it did." Her eyes filled again, but she did not cry. Why would she do that? Before I could answer, someone knocked hard on the fitting room door. Judith entered without waiting for permission. She glanced at the gown before looking at Sadie's bandage. "The hotel has a car ready for you," she said. "You should both leave now so everyone can calm down." She did not ask whether Sadie was in pain. She did not say the word sorry. "You saw the report Corinne prepared?" I asked. "I saw an email about security precautions. Your sister was worried you might object to the business signing. She prepared to call Sadie's fall deliberate before it happened." Judith pressed her lips together. "Corinne was under enormous pressure. She made a foolish decision, but keeping everyone trapped in this room will not improve it." "No one is trapped. We are documenting what happened. We will pay every medical expense. I will also have the bracelet repaired. There is a woman in town who works with pressed flowers." Sadie looked down at her hands. My mother spoke as if a replacement ribbon could erase the moment she had ordered an injured child to apologize. "You rushed to the dress before you looked at your granddaughter," I said. Judith lowered her voice. "I reacted badly because 200 people were watching. That is the problem. You cared more about what they saw than what Corinne did." She glanced toward Marcy and Tessa. "This is a family matter." "No. The moment you used venue staff to create a false report, it stopped being private." I held up the printed email. "Why did you need Sadie and me removed before the signing?" Judith paused long enough to answer more than her words did. "Leonard is trying to protect everyone's future," she finally said. "He has spent months arranging something that could support Corinne, Owen, and Sadie for years. You are reacting to individual expenses without understanding the whole plan. If it protects Sadie, why was it hidden from her trust protector? You need to speak to your father." "I intend to, with Nora present." Judith's expression hardened. "If you force lawyers into this before the documents are complete, you may destroy the only chance to recover what has already been spent." She left without touching Sadie or looking back at the gown. Leonard arrived 10 minutes later. When Tessa refused to leave Sadie alone with him, we moved into a small office across the corridor. My father shut the door and placed both hands on the desk between us. "I will transfer $20,000 from my personal account into Sadie's trust on Monday," he said. "In return, you will stop discussing the transactions with guests and allow the wedding to continue." You took more than 86,000. 20,000 covers the portion that could reasonably be questioned as personal wedding expense. Those are investment costs and cannot simply be reversed. You are offering to replace the amount you think will make me quiet. I am offering a practical solution before public accusations damage the value of the asset itself. What asset? He leaned back slightly. Ashford House. You do not own Ashford House. Not yet. Which is why the closing packet must be signed before midnight. The words came out naturally, and I saw the instant he realized he had given me information I did not have. There is another transaction tonight. Leonard's face returned to its controlled stillness. There is a scheduled escrow deposit connected to the purchase. It is not another wedding expense. How much? That figure means nothing without the full structure. My phone rang inside my purse. Nora's name appeared on the screen. I answered while Leonard watched me. Meredith, I have just received an automated alert, Nora said. A transfer order for $162,000 has been submitted from Sadie's trust to the Ashford escrow account. When does it move? Before midnight. I have placed a temporary administrative hold, but my authority to delay it without formal action is limited. I need evidence that the transaction does not primarily serve Sadie's interests. I looked through the office window. Tessa stood beside Sadie in the medical room. Beyond them, the corridor led to the bridal suite, the reception hall, and the room where Owen and Corinne were expected to sign the closing packet. If security had removed us after the fall, Tessa's email would have stayed hidden. I would not have seen the altered bustle. I would not have reached Owen, or learned there was another packet waiting for signatures. By the time I contacted Nora again, the money could already have been sitting in escrow under documents my father controlled. The fall had never been about a torn dress. It was a reason to remove the one person who could ask questions before the deadline. Nora's voice became quieter. Meredith, $86,420 was not the amount they intended to take in the end. It was only the amount they used to test whether you were paying attention. Nora asked me to put the call on speaker, so Leonard could hear every word. She explained that a trustee could invest trust assets, even in private property, but only when the beneficiary's interests came first. Leonard had to show that Sadie would receive a fair return, protection from loss, and independent oversight. He cannot use the trust to solve a family member's financing problem, Nora said. He also cannot disguise personal expenses as investment costs simply because the same property is involved. Leonard looked through the office window. The wedding was a launch event, he said. The property will begin taking bookings immediately. Nora did not argue with the label. Send me the complete closing packet, including every attachment, side letter, operating agreement, compensation schedule, and repurchase provision. You already have the investment summary. I asked for the complete packet. Leonard's jaw tightened. Some documents are still being finalized. Then no responsible trustee would release $162,000 before they were finalized. He left without answering and walked toward the private room reserved for the signing. Nora remained on the call while I opened the files she had already received. The first pages looked respectable. They described a limited liability company created to purchase Ashford House, renovate several guest rooms, and operate the estate as a wedding venue. Sadie's trust would provide most of the cash needed for the escrow deposit. In return, the trust would receive an ownership interest in the company. On paper, that matched Leonard's explanation. Then Nora directed me to the management section. Corinne and Owen's company would control daily operations. They would select vendors, approve renovations, set their salaries within a broad range, and collect management fees before profits were distributed. Sadie's trust would provide the largest amount of immediate cash, but it would have no direct vote over contracts, salaries, or major decisions. Where is the protection if the business loses money? I asked. That is one of the problems, Nora said. The trust assumes investment risk, but the managers receive compensation whether the venue earns a profit or not. A new message arrived while she was speaking. The closing attorney had forwarded several additional pages after learning the transfer had been placed on hold. Nora opened them first. "There is a repurchase attachment," she said. It allowed Corinne and Owen to buy the trust's ownership interest after 3 years for a fixed amount. The price included only a modest return, no matter how much the property increased in value after renovation. The trust would supply money for the purchase and carry the early risk. Corinne and Owen would control the business, draw salaries, and later buy Sadie's share before the venue reached its projected value. "If the business fails, Sadie absorbs the loss," I said. "If it succeeds, they take the growth. That is the practical effect." The flowers, catering, photography, and reception costs had been entered as brand launch expenses. Corinne's wedding was being treated as the first promotional event for the future venue. They had not merely taken money for a party. They had turned the party into evidence that the money was being invested. I thought about Sadie standing on that strip of silver tape, while adults discussed her future as if it were unused space. She had been told she was too young to need the money, and old enough to be blamed when their plan required a distraction. Tessa stayed with Sadie, while I asked Owen to meet me in a records room beside the administrative offices. He arrived without Corinne and closed the door. "The ceremony is on hold," he said. "Guests are moving into the reception hall. We need to decide what we are doing before this becomes impossible to recover from." "Did you know the trust was supplying the escrow deposit?" "I knew Leonard had arranged family financing." "Did you know the family financing belonged to Sadie?" He looked at the shelves behind me. "I knew it was a trust established for her benefit." "That is a yes." He said the money was sitting in conservative accounts and losing opportunities. "Ashford House has land, buildings, and an existing events license. This was not supposed to be money disappearing into a wedding. The trust paid your wedding vendors. They were also vendors for the launch." He used Leonard's language naturally. "Did you see the attachment allowing you and Corinne to buy Sadie's interest at a fixed price after she funded the riskiest years?" His eyes shifted toward the door. "That provision was described as a way to give the trust an exit. An exit chosen by the people receiving its money. Businesses need management control. You cannot have every investor interfering in daily decisions. Sadie is not an investor who chose this risk. She is an 11-year-old whose trustee arranged the deal with his daughter and future son-in-law." Owen's voice became quieter. "We were going to build something valuable. By the time Sadie went to college, the trust would have more than it started with. You do not know that. No investment comes with certainty. Would you sign this exact deal if the money belonged to your daughter?" He looked at me but did not answer. After a moment, Owen suggested a compromise. The closing could be canceled, the additional transfer could remain frozen, and everyone could review the documents the next morning. "Then let us finish the ceremony," he said. "Sadie can receive an apology. Corinne can address what happened after emotions settle. Nothing else has to be signed today. My daughter was placed behind a sabotage dress so security could remove us before your closing. I did not know about that. Now you do." His expression hardened. "I am trying to prevent one terrible afternoon from destroying several lives. You are trying to preserve the part of the afternoon that matters to you." He did not deny it. He wanted the photographs, the vows, and the public marriage preserved, even if the business arrangement collapsed. Sadie's humiliation had become another problem to manage later. When I returned to the medical room, Sadie sat beside Tessa with a paper cup of water. Music had started again inside the reception hall, as staff tried to keep guests occupied. Sadie looked at me. "I heard Aunt Corinne say I have 7 years before I need the money." I sat beside her. "She should not have discussed your future that way. Do grown-ups take money from kids because they think kids will forget?" I wanted to promise that every dollar would be returned and everything repaired before she had to think about it again. Nora's warning kept me from making a promise I could not keep. "Some adults tell themselves children will not notice until later," I said. "Sometimes they believe they can fix the damage before anyone understands it. What if they cannot? I do not know yet how much we can recover. I do know that you are not responsible for replacing it, protecting them or making this easier for them. Sadie looked at the bandage on her knee. I only wanted Aunt Corinne to like the bracelet. I know, Tessa's tablet chimed. Nora had sent a secure link to the closing packet that had just reached her. I opened it beside Sadie, careful not to let her see the financial pages. The documents included the operating agreement, the fixed-price repurchase attachment, and a certification required by the escrow company. The certification stated that I had reviewed the proposed investment as Sadie's mother, understood the use of the funds, and raised no objection. My name appeared in the text, but the signature line belonged to Corinne. By signing, she had declared that she personally discussed the investment with me and received my consent. I had never seen the page. Until the rehearsal, I had not known Sadie's trust was connected to Ashford House. Corinne entered with Judith behind her. Her eyes went immediately to the screen. Nora asked her to confirm whether the electronic signature was hers. Corinne leaned closer. The anger left her face as she read the certification. For the first time that day, she looked frightened for a reason that had nothing to do with her dress or guests. Corinne stared at her own signature on the certification and whispered that she had never signed that page. Corinne kept staring at the electronic signature, as though it might change if she waited long enough. Judith reached for the tablet, but Corinne pulled it away. I signed a stack of papers Dad brought to the house. I did not sign this page. Nora's voice came through the speaker. The account used to complete it is registered to you. That does not prove you reviewed the page, but we need the original audit record. Corinne looked toward the corridor. Leonard was gone. Meredith, I need to speak to you alone. I glanced at Sadie. Tessa sat beside her while the medic held an ice pack against her swollen knee. I will be in the office across the hall, I told her. The door will stay open. Corinne walked inside and nearly shut the door. I stopped it with my hand. You asked for privacy, not secrecy. She smoothed the skirt of her gown. The torn train was gathered over one arm. I am sorry I yelled at Sadie, she said. I was shocked and everyone was watching. I waited. I did not mean for her to fall that hard. The words settled between us. So you expected her to fall? Corinne looked toward the hallway. I expected the train to catch around her shoes. I thought she would stumble and pull some lace loose. Nothing like what happened. You cut the bustle loop. I loosened it. The pin was supposed to release when I stepped back, and you placed a child behind it. I needed a distraction. She explained that she expected me to become angry when Sadie tangled in the dress. Security would intervene, classify the damage as deliberate, and escort us out before the signing. I thought you would shout, she said. You always get protective when Sadie is involved. I took her to first aid. You were supposed to leave. The frustration in her answer showed she still considered my refusal to follow the plan the real problem. Who agreed to this? Mom knew I wanted a small incident. She said it was better than letting you interrupt the signing in front of Owen's partners. She made sure security had your name. Judith had not merely reacted badly after Sadie fell. She had agreed beforehand that her granddaughter could be blamed, provided the scene stayed manageable. Corinne stepped closer. I never wanted Sadie hurt. You wanted her frightened, humiliated, and accused of damaging your dress. I wanted you gone for an hour. You used her because you knew I would follow her. Her eyes filled with tears, but they did not erase her choice. I apologized. You apologized because the injury was worse than you planned. You have not apologized for using her shame as a business tool. Corinne looked away. Dad said the papers were legal. He said the money would be replaced before Sadie needed it. How much did you know had been used? The wedding expenses, $86,420. He said the vendors would stay with Ashford House after the launch. And the additional $162,000? Her head snapped toward me. What additional money? The transfer scheduled before midnight. I knew there was an escrow deposit. I did not know it came from Sadie's trust. What about the clause allowing you and Owen to buy out the trust after 3 years? I have never seen it. Until then, Corinne had believed public exposure was the greatest danger. Now she understood she did not know the deal she had helped protect. Leonard entered without knocking. "The closing attorney is waiting," he said. "Every minute we delay gives the owners another reason to cancel." Corinne held up the tablet. "Why is my signature on a statement saying Meredith approved the investment?" "You signed the authorization packet. Not this page. You authorized electronic completion of routine certifications. You told me they were vendor and financing forms." "They were. This certification supports the financing. It says I spoke to Meredith. It confirms the investment was discussed within the family. That is not the same thing." Leonard regarded her with mild disappointment. "If you stay composed, this can be corrected. Nora's hold is temporary. We can amend the certification, remove the disputed wedding costs, and preserve the purchase. You want me to sign again? I want you to understand the consequences before reacting. What happens if there is an investigation?" Leonard folded his hands. The proposal came from Carlisle Hale Events. The operating agreement names you and Owen as managers. The vendor contracts are tied to your wedding. Every substantive document bears your signatures. And yours? "I acted as trustee in response to an investment proposal from the company operating the property." Corinne stared at him. He had structured the deal so the daughter he always rescued could also become the person he blamed. "You made it look like this was my idea." "It was your idea to buy Ashford House. Not with Sadie's money. You knew the trust supplied capital. I knew about the wedding expenses. And you accepted them?" Corinne turned toward Judith, who stood in the doorway. "Mom, did you know the papers made me responsible?" Judith looked at Leonard first. "Your father knows how to handle this. Listen to him before someone says something that cannot be taken back. He just said everything points to me. He said it can be corrected. By me signing more papers." Judith's voice became urgent. "Corinne, if everyone remains calm, no one has to go to jail." The word jail stripped away the last of Corinne's confidence. She sank into a chair, and her torn train slid to the floor. Owen entered carrying part of the closing packet. His tie was loose, and several pages were folded at the corners. "I found another document." He placed a side letter on the desk. His signature appeared on the final page beside a date from 2 weeks earlier. "Did you sign that?" Corinne asked. "Yes," Leonard spoke first. "It is a standard financing commitment." "That is what you called it," Owen said. "You said the bank needed proof that our company would support the renovation." He read the letter. Carlisle Hale Events agreed that money in Sadie's trust could serve as bridge financing until the property was refinanced. The company also waived any requirement that the trust receive independent business advice before providing the funds. "You agreed that Sadie would not have her own advisor," I said. "I did not know that was what the clause meant. You own a renovation company. You have signed financing agreements." Leonard summarized it. "The deal benefited you, so you chose the summary over the document." Owen looked at his signature. "I was told Nora had reviewed everything. She had never received this letter." Corinne pointed at her certification. "My signature was copied. Owen's was not." "I signed what was put in front of me," Owen said. "I did not forge anything. No one accused you of forgery. You are trying to make profitable carelessness sound like innocence." Each of them had known enough to stop. Corinne knew Sadie's money paid for the wedding. Judith knew Sadie would be used to remove me. Owen knew the fund belonged to a child, but accepted the explanation that protected his opportunity. Leonard relied on all of them preferring useful half-truths to answers that might end the deal. Owen turned another page. His eyes stopped halfway down, and the color left his face. He did not ask who had forged Corinne's signature. He asked my father why the side letter promised to pay him a personal fee after the deal closed. Owen held the side letter in front of Leonard. "Why does this promise you a personal fee after closing?" My father did not reach for the document. He looked at Owen with the patience he reserved for people he considered emotional. "Because I assembled the financing, negotiated the trust's participation, and introduced the parties. Consulting fees are ordinary in a transaction of this size." Nora asked Owen to place the pages beneath Tessa's document camera so she could read them remotely. I stood beside the desk while each section appeared on the tablet. Leonard would receive compensation when the sale closed, another annual payment for overseeing Ashford House's financial operations, and the right to acquire part of the property after the trust funded the initial repairs. His purchase price was fixed and would not rise if the renovations increased the estate's value. Sadie's trust would supply the money when the risk was highest. Leonard would gain his ownership option after the roof, guest rooms, electrical system, and commercial kitchen had been improved with that money. Corinne read over Owen's shoulder. "You said you were helping us because we were family." "I am helping you," Leonard replied. "My compensation does not change the value of the plan." "You are going to own part of Ashford House?" "A minority interest, earned through my work. Paid for after Sadie carried the expensive part." He finally looked at her directly. "Do not repeat Meredith's language as though it were analysis." Nora moved us to the renovation schedule. The structure became clearer with every page. The trust would provide the escrow deposit and most of the first year's renovation capital. Corinne and Owen's company would operate the venue, approve its own management expenses, and draw salaries before any profit reached the trust. After the estate established a stronger booking history, they planned to refinance it through a commercial lender. That refinancing would repay part of the trust's cash. It would also activate the fixed-price provisions, allowing Corinne, Owen, and Leonard to purchase the trust's ownership interest. If Ashford House failed before refinancing, Sadie's trust would bear much of the loss. If it succeeded, the adults controlling the property could buy the trust out before its value reflected the improvements it had financed. I looked at my father. "You were using Sadie's money to buy the property, repair it, and prove it could earn revenue. Then you were going to let yourselves purchase her share at yesterday's price." "That is an inaccurate and hostile description." "Which part is inaccurate?" "The trust would receive interest, equity, and repayment through refinancing." "Does Sadie have a vote over renovation costs?" "No minor beneficiary votes on investment decisions." "Does Nora have approval rights over Corinne and Owen's salaries?" "The operating managers require independence." "Is there insurance protecting the trust from business losses?" "The property provides security." "Does the trust share proportionally in the increased value after the buyout option begins?" "The fixed return protects it from market uncertainty." "You protected everyone except Sadie," I said. "She cannot vote, cannot refuse the risk, cannot control the spending, and cannot keep the full benefit if the risk pays off. This is not an investment for her. You turned her into a bank that could not say no." Leonard's expression barely changed. "I turned idle money into a family asset. Ruth did not create that trust, so the balance could sit untouched while inflation weakened it. She created it for Sadie. And I am trying to give Sadie more than tuition. If this succeeds, she could inherit an interest in one of the region's strongest private event properties. She would inherit whatever you chose not to buy from her first." He folded his arms. "You repair dresses for a living, Meredith. You are reading complex financing as if every protective clause were evidence of theft." "My work taught me that covering damage does not repair the structure underneath it." Nora interrupted before he could answer. "Leonard, as trust protector, I am directing you to stop all activity involving the Ashford transaction and surrender administrative access pending review." His voice became colder. "You do not have grounds to remove me because Meredith dislikes an investment. I have undisclosed self-compensation, conflicted counterparties, prior payments that appear personal, a disputed beneficiary consent certification, and a transaction designed to close before complete review. I have more than enough grounds for temporary suspension. You can request clarification. You cannot interfere with a signed purchase contract without exposing the trust to liability. I am not declaring the contract void. I am suspending your authority and maintaining the hold on the $162,000 transfer." Nora said the action would not recover the money already spent or determine whether crimes had occurred. It would only stop more money from leaving before midnight. Leonard removed his phone from his pocket and tried to open the trustee portal. His face changed when the screen denied access. A call came almost immediately from the closing attorney. Owen answered and listened without speaking. When he ended the call, he said the escrow company would not proceed without verified funds. The sellers were free to cancel if the problem was not resolved within the contractual deadline. Owen turned on Corinne. If you had not staged that ridiculous scene with the dress, Meredith might never have challenged the closing today. Corinne stared at him. You knew the money came from Sadie's trust and signed away her independent review. Do not pretend my dress is the reason this failed. I did not forge her mother's consent. Neither did I. You created the account used to submit it. Dad had access to the account. Judith stepped between them. Stop attacking each other. Meredith has already given the guests enough to gossip about for the rest of our lives. I looked at her. Leonard arranged private profits. Corinne used Sadie to have me removed. Owen accepted money he knew belonged to a child. Your concern is still what the guests will say. My concern is that you announced allegations before understanding them. Did you know he was using Sadie's money? Judith glanced at Leonard, but this time he did not answer for her. I knew he planned to borrow from the trust for the purchase, she said. He told me it would be returned after refinancing. Did you know about his fee and ownership option? No, I did not. Did you ask? He handled the documents. Did you know Corinne planned to create an incident so security could remove us? Judith pressed her fingertips together. I knew she wanted you away from the signing. I believed the dress would be lightly damaged, and that you would leave with Sadie before an argument began. You helped use your granddaughter as bait, because you were afraid I would ask one question. I was afraid you would destroy Corinne's opportunity in front of everyone. She had not known every clause, but she knew my presence endangered the plan. Protecting Corinne's opportunity mattered more than asking why it required a child's humiliation. Leonard remained the only person in the room who did not raise his voice. Now that everyone has finished assigning moral labels, we should discuss the practical consequences. He placed a legal pad on the desk and wrote several figures. If I pursued a formal claim, he said the trust could face years of litigation over the vendor payments, the purchase contract, and the company agreements. Ashford's owners might sue for the failed closing. Corinne and Owen's company could seek reimbursement for expenses. Unwinding the transactions could raise tax questions, and attorneys, accountants, and experts would be paid before Sadie received anything. You are threatening to spend her money defending what you did, I said. I am explaining that outrage does not protect assets. He offered another path. The family would sign a confidential agreement. The additional transfer would remain canceled. Leonard would repay the $86,420 over 5 years, with modest interest. I would withdraw the complaint, agree not to contact licensing authorities or law enforcement, and state that the incident resulted from a misunderstanding about investment expenses. Nora warned me not to sign or promise anything. She also admitted she could not tell me without reviewing every contract how much a full dispute might cost. For the first time that day, Leonard's argument frightened me. I could refuse his offer and discover that protecting Sadie required draining the very fund I was trying to save. I could accept it and leave the people who had used her free to decide when and how they repaired the damage. My father saw the uncertainty on my face. He smiled and said, You can punish us, Meredith, but the person who will pay the final bill will be Sadie. Leonard's warning followed me, even after Nora ordered him out of the office. I watched through the glass as he crossed the corridor without looking at Sadie. He had just threatened that protecting her could destroy the money I was trying to save, yet he carried himself as if he had offered responsible advice rather than leverage. Nora stayed on the speaker while I packed the documents into a folder. Your father told you half the truth, she said. A contested trust matter can become expensive. That does not mean every dollar comes out of Sadie's account. She explained that Ruth had required the trustee to maintain a fidelity bond. The trust also carried fiduciary liability coverage. If an investigation proved fraud, self-dealing, or deliberate misrepresentation, the bond and insurance could reimburse losses and some legal expenses. Leonard's personal assets could also be reached for restitution. None of that guarantees a quick recovery, Nora said. The insurers may dispute coverage, and the documents will have to be examined carefully. But his claim that Sadie must pay every cost is designed to frighten you into settling before anyone reviews what he did. I asked the question I had been avoiding. Could refusing his offer still leave her with less? It could delay access to the money, and there may be expenses that are not fully recovered. I will not promise otherwise. Your decision is whether a private repayment plan controlled by Leonard is safer than a formal process that removes his control. That distinction mattered. He had presented fear as certainty and secrecy as protection. I told Nora not to accept any private proposal on my behalf. Sadie's father met us outside Ashford House. We had divorced without turning our daughter into a prize to be divided, and he understood from my voice that this was not the moment to demand every detail. He crouched beside Sadie, looked at the bandage on her knee, and asked whether she wanted to ride with him or me. When she chose me, he simply took our bags and followed us home. At the apartment, he made soup, found her softest pajamas, and sat with her while I spoke to Nora and the venue. He did not tell me what legal action to take. He did not promise to confront my family. He helped our daughter feel safe and let me make the decisions that belonged to me. The contrast hurt more than I expected. By the next afternoon, the wedding had become family news. It did not spread across the internet or appear on television. It moved through phone calls, church groups, former bank colleagues, real estate contacts, and the small network of people who knew Ashford House. My aunt told me I should have handled the money privately. A cousin said Leonard was 70 and deserved peace in his later years. Another relative reminded me that Judith's blood pressure was fragile, as though my mother's health made Sadie's trust available for family use. No one who called began by asking how Sadie was feeling. They spoke about a ruined wedding, a failed purchase, my parents' humiliation, and the possibility that Leonard might lose everything he had built. Their concern always started after the consequences reached an adult. I stopped answering after the 5th call. 2 days later, I reopened my shop. The quiet workrooms smelled of starch, cedar blocks, and old silk. Wedding gowns waited on padded forms beneath cotton covers. Some had yellowed seams. Others carried wine stains, torn hems, or repairs made decades earlier with the wrong thread. Restoration never began by hiding the damage. I had to uncover each weakened seam, remove the careless stitches, and identify where the original fabric ended and the later repair began. Covering a tear without examining it only trapped the strain beneath a prettier surface. Leonard's agreement offered the financial version of that mistake. He wanted to place clean language over damaged structure and call it repaired. Corinne arrived shortly before closing with the gown zipped inside a garment bag. She looked smaller without the bridal makeup and jeweled veil. She placed the bag across my cutting table and opened it until the torn train lay between us. "I brought the lace, the cut loop, and the pin," she said. "You said they mattered." "They do. You can have them for the investigation." Evidence was not a gift she owned the right to trade, but I let her continue. "In return, I want your written agreement that you will not pursue me for planning the incident with the dress. I will cooperate about Dad's financial documents. I will tell Nora." He controlled the accounts and prepared the signatures. "You knew Sadie's money paid for your wedding." "I knew what Dad told me. I did not design the trust structure. You designed the reasons security would remove us." Her eyes moved toward the gown. "My real estate license is already under review because the Ashford deal involved a minor's trust. If you accuse me of deliberately harming a child, I could lose my career." "You were willing to label Sadie's actions deliberate before she fell." "I never expected her to be injured." "You expected her to be blamed." Corinne pushed the garment bag toward me. "This proves the bustle was altered. Without it, everything becomes an argument about what people remember." "No. Tessa has photographs taken before the repair. She has your email, the placement diagram, and the timestamp. The venue system records when the report was created. I will not exchange the truth for the same dress you used to humiliate my daughter. Her face hardened. You are protecting Dad by refusing my cooperation. I am refusing to let you purchase silence by choosing which part of the truth I am allowed to use. Corinne stared at me, as if she still expected me to negotiate. When I did not, she zipped the gown closed and carried it back toward the door. You always wanted to prove I was the bad daughter, she said. This is not about what kind of daughter you are. It is about what you chose to do to mine. After she left, I stood beside the empty cutting table and understood why Leonard's private agreement appealed to all of them. It would let each person reduce the story to the part they found survivable. Leonard would call the money an investment error. Judith would call the wedding scene an emotional misunderstanding. Owen would call his signatures careless. Corinne would call the fall an accident. Sadie would be the only person left carrying the whole truth. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table while I wrote down what she remembered. I told her she only needed to speak once and could stop whenever she wanted. She described Corinne placing both of her shoes on the silver tape. She remembered being told not to move. Just before the fall, she saw Corinne look over her shoulder, pull part of the train closer with one hand, and step backward toward her. I thought she was fixing it, Sadie said. Then the lace wrapped around my shoes. I recorded her words without correcting them or asking her to repeat the painful parts. When she said she was tired, I closed the notebook. She did not need to perform her fear repeatedly to make adults believe her. The next morning, Tessa called. Corinne had contacted the venue's insurer and claimed Sadie intentionally grabbed the train after being told to stay away from it. Tessa said she would sign an affidavit describing the changed position, the pre-written report, and the condition of the bustle. She had stayed silent before the fall because she thought she was following an unpleasant client request. She would not remain silent while Corinne blamed a child for something the adults had prepared. Marcus also released the system log through the venue's attorney. It showed that the incident file had been created at 2:12 p.m., opened by security twice before 2:27, and updated seconds after Sadie fell. Corinne's new version could not make that timeline disappear. For the first time since the wedding, I felt the facts becoming stronger than Leonard's threats. That feeling lasted until Judith appeared alone at my apartment that evening. She carried an old cream envelope with Ruth's handwriting across the front. She said Leonard had removed one page from the family trust records years earlier and kept it where Nora would never see it. My mother placed the envelope on the table and said, "If you read this page, your father will never manage the trust again." And I knew that before Sadie fell. I opened the cream envelope while Judith sat across from me at the kitchen table. The page inside was not a hidden will, a deed, or a promise of money. It was a signed instruction from Ruth to the independent protector of Sadie's trust. Ruth had anticipated that the person managing the fund might someday face pressure from other family members. Her instruction was direct. If a trustee used family loyalty, emotional coercion, concealment, or personal benefit to influence decisions involving a minor beneficiary, the trust protector was to remove that trustee immediately and preserve every related record for outside review. Leonard had not merely violated a vague principle. Ruth had described almost exactly what he had done. The page carried the same date as the original trust agreement, along with the signatures of Ruth, her attorney, and 2 witnesses. A handwritten notation at the bottom indicated that copies were meant to remain with both the family records and the trust protector. Nora had never received hers. "Where did you find this?" I asked. Judith looked toward Sadie's closed bedroom door before answering. "Your father kept the old trust file in the cabinet at home. I found the page when he started preparing the Ashford documents." "How long ago?" "Almost 5 months." The answer was worse than I expected. She had not discovered it after the wedding, when the damage was already done. She had found it before the vendor payments, before the escrow transfer, and before Corinne placed Sadie behind the dress. "You knew Nora could remove him." "Yes. You knew that would stop him from using Sadie's money." "I knew it would stop the transaction until someone else reviewed it." Why did you hide the page? Judith pressed her palms against the table. Leonard said Nora would reject the project because it involved Corinne. He said outsiders never understand how families build something together. If he were removed, the sellers would walk away, and Corinne would lose Ashford House. That was the point of independent review. We believed the property would succeed. You did not need to believe anything. You had written instructions telling you what to do. Her voice tightened. You are looking at this after everything went wrong. At the time, the wedding was paid for, contracts had been signed, and Owen's company had already committed resources. Exposing that page would have destroyed all of it. You mean it would have stopped all of it? She looked down. I thought of Sadie lying on the stone floor while my mother lifted the torn lace. The question I needed to ask had nothing to do with investment structures or legal duties. When Sadie was bleeding, why did you tell her to apologize? Judith's mouth opened, but no answer came. You knew Leonard had hidden Ruth's instruction. You knew Corinne wanted us removed before the signing. You knew Sadie had been placed behind the dress because of that plan. Why did you look at an injured child and demand that she apologize? I did not know she would be hurt. That does not answer me. Judith's eyes filled with tears. There were 200 people watching. The musicians had stopped. Corinne's dress was torn. Owen's family was staring at us, and everyone was waiting to see what I would do. So you chose the person least able to defend herself. I panicked. You did not panic when you protected Corinne. You did not panic when you tried to send us away. You knew exactly what result you wanted. She wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. A wedding collapsing in front of 200 people was a humiliation I could not bear. The money felt different. Leonard kept saying it could be repaid before Sadie was old enough to need it. There it was. A child's money could be repaired later. A child's trust could be rebuilt later. A child's humiliation could be discussed later. What could not be allowed was for guests to watch the Hale family lose control of a perfect wedding. You were more ashamed of people seeing the truth than of what the truth was. Judith did not deny it. She pushed the envelope toward me. Use the page to remove your father. Let Nora take over the trust and cancel whatever remains of the Ashford arrangement. You will have everything you need to protect Sadie. That is not all you came here to ask. Her shoulders lowered. Do not give the records to the district attorney. I had expected the request, but hearing it still made something inside me go quiet. Leonard has already lost the transaction. Corinne lost her wedding and may lose her career. Owen's partners are leaving. People we have known for decades will not return our calls. The family has been publicly destroyed. The family was not destroyed by the people who discovered what happened. Your father is 70 years old. He was 70 when he designed the agreements. He could go to prison. He knew that when he created false documents. Judith leaned forward. How much punishment is enough, Meredith? The money can be restored. Leonard can be removed privately. We can sell assets and repay what was spent. No one needs to drag this through a criminal court. The request was dressed differently, but it was the same one she had made beside Corinne's torn dress. The person who had been harmed was expected to stop as soon as the consequences became uncomfortable for the person who caused them. I will not decide Leonard's punishment, I said. I will give the evidence to people whose job is to determine what he did. You know what that will do to us. I know what all of you chose to do to Sadie. Judith left without the envelope. Nora came to my shop the following morning. We placed Ruth's page beside the original trust agreement and compared the signatures, dates, paper, and witness information. Nora contacted the law firm that had prepared the trust. Its archived index confirmed that an additional trustee removal instruction had existed, even though its copy was missing from the active file. I signed a request for a full fiduciary investigation. I also requested that Leonard, Judith, and Corinne have no direct contact with Sadie while the financial and insurance matters were reviewed. The restriction was not a permanent judgment. It prevented them from calling, visiting, sending gifts through relatives, or asking Sadie to change what she remembered. The following months did not unfold in one dramatic courtroom scene. They came in short meetings, certified letters, recorded interviews, and documents delivered in thick envelopes. Leonard was formally removed as trustee. His access remained suspended, while accountants reconstructed every Ashford transaction. The escrow transfer never left the trust, and the purchase agreement was unwound after the sellers refused to extend the deadline. Ashford House was sold to another buyer. The $86,420 already spent was submitted as a claim against Leonard's fidelity bond. The bonding company did not immediately agree to pay everything, but Ruth's missing instruction, the undisclosed personal fee, and the false certification made it impossible to dismiss the matter as a failed investment. Corinne's electronic account was examined. Investigators found that a draft claim involving damage to her wedding gown had been created before Sadie fell. She had not predicted the exact injury, but she had prepared to describe any damage as the act of a disruptive guest. The real estate board temporarily suspended her license while it reviewed her role in the Ashford financing and the statements she made to the insurer. Owen returned the consulting reimbursement his company had received. One of his business partners withdrew after reading the side letter and learning Owen had accepted financing from a child's trust without independent review. He continued to insist that he had relied on Leonard's expertise. The documents showed how willingly he had done so. Judith cooperated after surrendering Ruth's page, but cooperation did not erase 5 months of silence. She was added to the civil claim because she knew the removal instruction existed and helped conceal it while the transactions continued. She was not permitted to see Sadie. Each consequence reached them differently, but none of it felt like celebration. I watched accounts, licenses, relationships, and reputations begin to change because of decisions made long before I spoke at the wedding. The night before the court was scheduled to review the proposed resolutions, Sadie sat beside me on the living room couch. She had heard relatives discussing whether Leonard and Judith might have to sell their home to cover restitution. She twisted the edge of a cushion between her fingers and asked, "Are Grandma and Grandpa losing their house because I tore Aunt Corinne's dress?" Sadie's question hurt because she was not asking about a house. She was asking whether one mistake by an 11-year-old could destroy an entire family. I sat beside her and drew a simple line across a sheet of paper. At the beginning, I wrote the date Leonard first authorized money from her trust. Farther along, I marked the vendor payments, the Ashford documents, Corinne's false certification, and the security report created at 2:12. Only after all of those events did I write the time Sadie fell, 2:27. "The money was taken before you touched the dress," I told her. "The papers were prepared before you arrived. Aunt Corinne had already planned to blame you, and Grandpa had already scheduled another transfer. Your fall did not cause any of those choices." Sadie traced the line with one finger. "But everyone found out because the dress tore. They found out that afternoon because I refused to leave. That is different from causing it. Would Grandma and Grandpa still have lost things if I had not fallen? Maybe it would have taken longer for us to discover everything. The consequences would still belong to the people who made the decisions. You were only there when the truth became impossible to hide." She looked toward the paper again. "So I did not ruin the wedding." "No. Corinne built her wedding on money she knew belonged to you. She created the situation that hurt you because she wanted to keep that secret. A wedding cannot be ruined by the truth if it was already being held together by a lie." Sadie leaned against me. Her body did not immediately relax, but she stopped twisting the cushion in her hands. The following morning, Nora met us outside the courthouse. Sadie stayed with her father because I did not want her sitting through adults debating losses they had once expected her to absorb. The final resolutions reflected the differences between what each person had done. Leonard admitted that he had used his authority over the trust to benefit himself and other family members. He pleaded guilty to fraudulently converting trust funds and submitting false financial documents. The court also considered the hidden compensation agreement, the forged certification, and his attempt to transfer another $162,000 after concealing Ruth's instructions. He received 14 months in custody, followed by supervised release. He was permanently barred from serving as a trustee, financial guardian, estate manager, or fiduciary for anyone else. Restitution was ordered against his personal assets, and the consulting fee he had expected from Ashford House became further evidence of his self-interest, rather than a reward for his work. Leonard listened without looking at me. Even then, he carried himself like a man enduring the incompetence of others. He never offered Sadie an apology that did not include an explanation of how he had intended to replace the money later. Judith avoided a heavier criminal charge because she surrendered Ruth's page, gave investigators access to the family files, and confirmed when Leonard had begun preparing the Ashford transaction. Her cooperation mattered, but it did not erase the months she had spent protecting him. She accepted civil liability for helping conceal the removal instruction and for participating in the plan to have Sadie and me expelled from the wedding. She and Leonard sold their house as part of the restitution agreement and moved into a smaller rental. When I later explained that to Sadie, I reminded her of the timeline again. They did not sell their house because a dress tore. They sold it because money had to be returned after adults took it and used it for themselves. Judith was not allowed to contact Sadie directly. Being her grandmother did not create an automatic right to visit, call, send gifts, or request forgiveness through relatives. Any future contact would require Sadie's agreement, professional guidance, and proof that Judith could respect boundaries without turning guilt into another form of pressure. Corinne's consequences arrived through several systems rather than one dramatic sentence. Her real estate license was suspended for 3 years. She admitted altering the dress arrangement, preparing a false damage claim, and using an electronic account through which misleading documents had been submitted. She was ordered to repay the portion of the vendor expenses she had knowingly accepted from Sadie's trust. Ashford House was gone, her wedding never resumed, and the business image she had spent years constructing collapsed when clients learned why the licensing board had acted. Corinne wrote to me once. The first page described everything she had lost. Only near the end did she mention what Sadie had experienced. I did not answer. An apology that began with the speaker's losses and treated the injured child as an afterthought was not yet accountability. Corinne was free to change, but Sadie was not required to become the audience for that process. Owen ended his relationship with Corinne within weeks of the failed closing. I did not mistake that decision for courage. He had known enough about the source of the money to ask questions and had chosen not to ask them. As part of the civil resolution, his company returned the reimbursements and fees connected to the Ashford proposal. He also signed a statement acknowledging that he had relied on Leonard's summaries because reading the full documents might have destroyed an opportunity he wanted. That admission was the most honest thing he did. He had not been tricked into complete ignorance. He had protected his ignorance because it was profitable. Restoring Sadie's trust took nearly a year. The canceled transfer returned immediately. The fidelity bond covered most of the money already spent after the company completed its investigation. The remaining balance came through restitution from Leonard, Judith, Corinne, and Owen's company. Fees were deducted, and the final number was not magically larger than before. It was restored to the amount Sadie should have had, along with the ordinary growth it would likely have earned if Leonard had left it properly invested. Nora recommended that I become a co-trustee, but not the only person in control. An independent trust company was appointed beside me. Major decisions required review. Records were sent automatically to Nora, and no family member could move money through private agreements. I agreed because protecting Sadie did not mean proving I was the one person who could never be wrong. Ruth had tried to prevent unchecked power. I would not repeat Leonard's mistake by demanding all of it for myself. I did not use the restored money to buy a larger home, take an expensive trip, or create a reward for surviving the case. The fund remained what Ruth intended it to be, protection for Sadie's education and future choices. Several months later, an older woman brought a wedding gown from the 1940s into my shop. Her mother had worn it after the war, She had worn it 28 years later, and she wanted it restored for her granddaughter. The satin had weakened along the waist, and several hand-sewn loops had broken beneath the skirt. Sadie sat beside me at the cutting table and helped sort lengths of ribbon. She chose a narrow blue ribbon to sew inside the gown, as it's something blue. Her stitches were uneven at first, but she removed them patiently and began again. When the work was finished, the ribbon rested inside the dress, where only the bride would know it was there. It did not hide damage. It became part of a careful repair that respected what the gown had survived. Sadie ran her fingertips over the restored seam. "I used to think wedding dresses were supposed to stay perfect," she said. "Most things worth keeping need repair at some point." She smiled and closed the tissue paper over the gown. The dress no longer made her think first of stone beneath her knee, her aunt's voice, or 200 people watching her cry. It had become fabric again, something that could carry a kinder promise from one generation to another. As we turned off the shop lights, Sadie asked, "The next time someone says family has to come first, what will we say?" I smiled because I finally understood what a real family was supposed to put first.